Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is Malcolm Bach, who's an Alexander Technique teacher living in Montreal, Canada. He's been teaching for around 35 years, and he's made somewhat of a specialty in combining the Alexander Technique and running. He's written a book called The Art of Running, and he has a background in running himself. He was a competitive runner and coach. He won the Canadian Half Marathon Championship in 2011 and 2012, and the Cross Country Championship in 2016. And his combination of Alexander Technique and running he refers to as the art of running, and he gives workshops in that around the world. And we're going to talk today about, I'll just give you the title of this podcast. It's going to be The Thorny Question of the Foot Plant. So this is going to be about feet. And Malcolm's going to talk a little bit about some ideas that he has come up with on this topic. Malcolm, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Robert.
So, what is it that got you especially interested in what you refer to as the foot plant, which I believe you said was sort of the connection between the foot and the ground, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What got you interested in that?
Yeah, without being too technical, it's the kind of the way that your foot comes down on the ground when you're walking,
right?
And you know how you're balancing yourself on your feet when you're, let's say, it's just standing still.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot going on in your feet, maybe way more than I realized,
Mm-hmm.
and some recent experiences have really piqued my interest in this connection with the ground,
Mm-hmm.
and the possibilities that it holds for our work and for working with other people. Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, there's nothing like pain. There's nothing like a little bit of pain to focus your attention. And I've been running for many years, and more now that I'm in my 60s, I've been getting a bit more pain in running. More recently, something in my right hamstring, back of my right thigh, has been niggling away now for some years. And also I've been getting some pain in my feet, particularly in my right foot.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was at the Congress in Chicago, I worked with a friend of ours, John Macy,
Mm-hmm.
who said, well, you know, the problem you're having with your hamstring and your foot is due to the fact that your pelvis is kind of twisted. And I was completely unaware of this. I'd been, giving my directions and all the rest of it, and I wasn't getting any joy. And he worked a little bit on my pelvis. He's a physiotherapist as well as an Alexander teacher. And all of a sudden, some things started to when he adjusted my pelvis a little bit. All of a sudden, I started to feel different, and I thought I was leaning over about on a 45-degree angle to the side when I was walking, and I looked in the mirror, and I was straight up and down, and that was just from untwisting my pelvis a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So fast forward about a month, and I was in England doing some workshops, and I came across a woman by the name of Helen Hall, who wrote a book called Even With Your Clothes On. And, even with your shoes on. Even with your shoes on.
Yeah.
I'm sure she played with that title a bit. And she had me stand on a treadmill with a force plate in it where she could actually read where my center of gravity was coming down in my feet and what my feet were doing when I stood, when I walked, and when I ran.
Mm-hmm.
And it was quite amazing to me to see that a couple of things were happening, that my balance was not even between my feet. It was more on my left foot.
Mm-hmm.
And that when I walked or ran, that my feet, there was no sort of my feet would stay perfectly straight. There was no sort of side to side or what they call pronation and supination in my feet. My feet didn't rock and roll. They stayed perfectly straight.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, this is not the normal movement in your feet. Your feet are supposed to rock in and out a little bit on your landing and when you come off the ground. And then she took me over and she had me do a very simple exercise where she had me in a lunge. She put a couple of wedges on the outside of my right foot, and she had me just put weight onto that right foot, bend the knee, straighten the leg again, take the weight off that foot, and she had me repeat this back and forth. So if you can imagine sort of stepping out with your leg straight and then bending into a lunge and then coming back out of it. She repeated this about 8 times. It took less than a minute. And she put me back on the force plate, and all of a sudden, both my feet are rocking and rolling like they're supposed to, and my pelvis had untwisted.
Wow. Yeah.
And this is with less than 1 minute's work.
Right.
And it
right.
and it felt like, oh my goodness, it felt as astounding as when John Macy sort of moved my pelvis a little bit and sort of said, okay, now what does your leg feel like? Subsequent to that, the pain that I've had in my right hamstring for the last couple of years, which has come and gone, is gone and hasn't come back since.
Right.
And that pain, I've thrown a lot of money at it over the years through, I tried massage, chiropractic, deep tissue work, strength training, stretching. I've thrown a lot of stuff and a lot of money at it. It didn't change. And this one thing, where all of a sudden my foot got unlocked and started to pronate and supinate properly, changed what was going on in my right hamstring. And it was so startling to me because I'd almost given up hope that this happened.
Right,
I sort of said, okay, whoa, wait a second, what's going on here? So, as a good Alexandrian, I went back to the Bible, evolution of a technique, and I had a little read, and it, there's that piece in there where he names the name of the guy. Alexander names the name of the guy who told him to grip the floor with his feet.
Right. Yep.
So here's the quote, and I've got it in front of me here. He says, on recalling this experience, I continued with the aid of mirrors to observe the use of myself more carefully than ever and came to realize that what I was doing with my feet, legs, and toes when standing to recite was exerting a most harmful general influence upon the use of myself throughout my organism.
Yeah, yeah.
Now,
a lot of people forget that. A lot of people forget that, don't they?
He doesn't say that about his back. He doesn't say that about his head and neck.
Yeah.
He only says it about his feet.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And then he skips over it.
Yeah.
Then it disappears.
Yeah, yeah.
So he fixes his feet, and everything gets better after that.
Yeah.
But it's kind of skipped over. It's sort of like the primary control stops at the knees.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. It doesn't go down to the feet. Right. So anyway, it got me thinking and questioning a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think people forget just how complex their feet are. I mean, your feet and your hands are kind of similar in a lot of ways, except that your feet are weight bearing. So, but you still have all those little joints in there, and they're pretty complex structures, and it's easy to develop habits of standing and walking and running that don't make good use of the structure and end up causing the kinds of discomfort you have. Also, of course, John Macy, we should say, as you say, he's a PT and an Alexander teacher in Omaha, a good buddy of mine. We work together all the time, and he practices a type of PT that is not your standard PT at all.
Right.
It comes from actually from a guy here in Lincoln who developed it, and it's very heavily influenced by the idea that we are not all that symmetric in our bodies. That it looks kind of symmetric from the outside, but you go into the torso and look around, and there's no symmetry there at all. The heart's on one side, the lungs are asymmetrical,
Interesting.
it's
Yeah.
the organs, and there are internal twists in there that are not symmetric at all. And so John was, I think, probably drawing on some of that when he
Yeah.
adjusted your hip orientation. And I had that same issue many years ago and went to the guy himself, and he made a huge difference in my standing and walking.
Yeah.
But yeah, so feet, and I think feet just tend to be forgotten. They're far away, right, from your head, from your eyes.
I agree. Well, not only that, but here's another thing. That Alexander's direction was knees to go forward and away.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying I'm suffering from OCD or anything like that, but many good Alexandrians, I directed my knees forward and away, right? But guess what? Your foot's supposed to pronate, which means the heel is supposed to roll in when you land, right? It can't roll in if your knee's going out.
Yeah. I've never been a big fan of the knees direction, so I can't really
I agree. I hear you, but it was
speak to
one of
that.
Alexander's big
It was,
four, right?
yeah, it was, absolutely.
And so I was trying to figure out, well, why the hell don't my feet pronate and supinate when I run and walk? And I think because I've been, maybe misunderstanding the direction of knees forward and away but I often remember. I remember one time with Shoshana when I was working with her, and she had, I'd come back into class after 20 years, and she was working on me with another student in the class, and I went to stand up, and she said, "Well, did you notice how your knees came in a little bit when you stood up?" And I thought, "Oh God, I didn't do that, did I?" But guess what? I was supposed to do that, because when your knees roll in and you pronate a little bit, you actually engage your glutes, which are the biggest, strongest muscles in your body, and it actually helps to straighten your hip.
Yeah.
If you don't do that, you don't use those muscles, and you compensate by overusing others, maybe your back muscles for all I know, or your neck. This is like a bit of a shock, and I went, "Oh my God, you mean my knee's supposed to go in as well as go out?" And this brought me, because this woman, Helen Hall, is strongly influenced by a guy by the name of Gary Ward. And Gary Ward wrote a book called What the Foot. And part of his theory is that there's no such thing as bad use. That the body is doing the best it can with where you center yourself. Right. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And he said, yeah. So, for example, I've had a number of knee injuries. My right knee, I've broken my right ankle, I've torn my right hamstring. And she said, well, doesn't it make sense that your body would have shifted a little bit over to your left foot to take a little bit of the pressure off your damaged right knee? And I thought, well, I didn't do that consciously. She says, well, if we look at the information from the foot plate, from the force plate, we could see that your body is shifted and turned a little bit over towards your left side. And she said that makes perfect sense, because if you damage your knee, you would unconsciously protect it a little bit, and then brain would figure out a way for you to, I won the Canadian half marathon championship with the pelvis twisted to the left. My brain obviously figured out something, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah. She said it's not optimum. It's not optimal. Now that your knee is healed, you don't need to be over there anymore. And that's what that little drill with the wedges got me to sort of shift a little bit and come back and find a new center, a more accurate center of my body. And then when I do that, then things start to work differently.
Right.
And this is subconscious, by the way. This is not me consciously trying to do something. This is giving my brain an experience of where my new center is, and then letting it figure out how to organize me from there.
Right. Well,
I don't know.
so the thing that's interesting about what your experience is, you had one intervention in the hip itself, right? Your pelvis, and then another in the feet.
Yes.
And they both kind of complemented each other. But I wonder, see, I mean, where my thinking has gone in all of this is right directly to center of gravity questions.
Yeah.
First of all, where is your center of gravity, and actually locating it. And it's pretty easy to locate. It's a couple inches below your navel, and it's pretty much in the middle, front to back,
Yeah.
side to side.
Yeah.
And then the question, and you can manipulate that. Once you know where it is, you can start to use it. But, and I don't want to go into all of that, but then the question is, from my point of view, gravity is drawing your center of the gravitational field of the Earth is drawing your center right down to the center of the Earth. But of course it doesn't get there. And the reason it doesn't get there, and this is, I think, a big misunderstanding among a lot of even people in the Alexander world, the reason that we're not in the center of the Earth doing this podcast together is that the Earth is has a fairly hard surface. And that surface, when you stand on it or walk on it or run on it, it gets distorted by you. And it wants to get back to where it was. So it's literally pushing up against you to restore itself.
Yeah.
And that push when you're standing is pretty much focused on the soles of your feet.
Absolutely.
And the question then is, okay, and then that's an upward push coming right from the earth. And if you're sitting, it's pushing up against your sits bones. Either way, that upward pressure from the earth optimally should be transmitted right through your whole body, right? Through your feet, legs, pelvis, torso, neck, and right up to your head. Yeah. And that's the up of forward and up. But there are a lot of ways to mess with that. And
well, there sure are. And when you stand on a force plate, you're going to see.
You find out real quickly what they are. Some of them,
you'll see very quickly that it may be pushing up way more through one foot than through the other.
Or, yes.
Guess what? And you're not even going to feel that.
You won't feel it because.
But your whole body is adjusting to that. Or your brain is adjusting to your body to where you allow your weight to come down through your feet, where your center of gravity is actually coming down and playing out through your feet.
Right.
And if it isn't centered, then that's going to affect what's going on in your movement and in your balance.
Right.
And this is something that I want to know a lot more about because it has a pretty enormous effect on what's happening up the food chain.
Absolutely.
And as an Alexander, we're always thinking from the top of the food, well, we think of it as the top of the food chain down.
Right.
But guess what? You probably have even more of an effect coming up than you have coming down.
Well, the surface of your feet, certainly if you're walking, especially if you're walking barefoot, but even with a shoe, it's just being transmitted through the shoe. That's where you arrive at something that's going to exert an upward force on you. And that and it's like the intersection of the downward pull of gravity and the upward push of the earth, that place on the surface of your feet, that's where it all comes together.
Yep.
And if
so just imagine that in your body, that's not coming straight up through your spine.
Right. And the ways that cannot happen are for certainly the asymmetrical thing you were talking about, more more on one foot. But it could be little twists and turns on the way up, like if your ankles or your knees or your hips or your spine is twisted or there's little distortions, then it doesn't get to travel up quite as smoothly as would be optimal. It gets pushed.
That's what I'm thinking
Yeah.
right now, and that's where it gets interesting. And it's sort of like, okay, so where do you start?
Yeah.
Well, we start with the head-neck relationship.
Right.
Or, traditionally, at least, that's where we start.
Right.
And that's fine.
Mhm.
But sometimes
that's not going to do it all.
It's not going to do it, and especially, and Alexander said, we don't necessarily interpret accurately what we're sensing,
Right.
And that's certainly true. If it's habit, we kind of feel, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way it should be. Amen.
Right.
And it's only when you get an experience like I had with John or with Helen that you start to realize, holy smokes.
Yeah.
What I was considering to be in my Alexander glory normal,
Yeah.
isn't, or
Right.
normal or optimal isn't. And it was only maybe a bit like Alexander when things went wrong that it caused me to sort of look a little bit harder at what was happening and to ask some questions and begin to say, okay, when we lift up this rock, what's crawling around underneath there? and
Right.
and it's quite amazing when you start to look at it. You realize, oh, okay. At least in my case, I really feel like I want to know a whole lot more about how what's going on in our feet affects everything on up from there. That's
Right.
That's the big question. And for Alexander, I sort of wonder, well, why did he skip over it like that? It's almost become like it was almost a footnote in that.
Mhm.
I mean, he talks about his initial discovery. I've gone back because I must have read The Use of the Self 30 or 40 times. I used to teach it in a class every year, so I'd read it at least twice a year for 10 years.
Mhm.
And he talks about in the beginning where he noticed this misuse in his neck. He's sucking in air and pulling his head back, and and he noticed that, and he said, well, that was my first discovery, right? That's
Right.
the first thing he writes. But guess what? The misuse of his feet was happening then as well. He just didn't notice it.
Mhm. Or
But you
it might be even more accurate to say, instead of misuse of his feet, makes it sound like his feet were living a little life of their own down there, but really it was a kind of misuse of his whole self, perhaps caused by that instruction to grip the floor, which I guess was an acting idea that he internalized at some point. And if you think about it, trying to grip the floor with your feet is a losing proposition. It's just not. You're not going to grip the floor, but you're going to tense, and that tension is a whole body tension. And I think he got drawn. I think he probably got sucked into the head neck thing. It was maybe easier for him to see in the mirror, sense it directly, but I do think there was a kind of a neglect of this larger picture. But I would reframe. I've tended to reframe what the Alexander technique is in terms of not just how we organize ourselves optimally in isolation, but how we deal with the forces that are actually operating on us on this planet. And they're strong forces. Gravity is inherently a weak force in the physics system of forces, but our nearest neighbor, the Earth, is gigantic compared to us, and so it's a pretty strong force. If you fall over on the ground and hit your head, you could attest to that. And the upward push is a very strong force, and there are other forces as well. There's atmospheric pressure, there's heat and light, and so on. But I would say really the Alexander technique should be how we organize ourselves to make the best use of the situation we're in. And our situation is we're living on this planet it has certain properties, and they're not likely to change just because we'd like them to change. And in fact,
Well, you're right. You're right. You're
you know,
right. Now, let's say we want to make the best use of ourselves within the properties that we find
right,
within which we find ourselves here.
right, right,
But so imagine for a second, you must have experienced at some point you're walking along on a road of and you get a pebble in your shoe.
right.
And you've got a backpack on or something like that, and you can't take it out right away,
Mm-hmm.
right? So every time you step down, that pebble is going into some part of your foot,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Now you're having to deal with gravity and counter push and all the rest of it. Those things that haven't changed, but you've got a pebble in your shoe. Everything that you do at that point, in terms of how you're dealing with gravity, etc., changes. Now
Right.
imagine that pebble is in your shoe, but you don't feel it, but you're reacting to it anyway.
Yeah.
That's what this discovery said to me, is that I've had a pebble in my shoe for the last umpteen years.
Mm-hmm.
It's got me to the point where my hamstring won't heal because I'm putting too much strain on that side of my body as I compensate for an old knee injury, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter how much I strengthen, stretch, massage, chiro, whatever, as long as I'm adjusting to that invisible and unfelt pebble in my shoe, that thing in my hamstring is never going away.
Mm-hmm.
Take the pebble out of the shoe,
Mm-hmm.
and all of a sudden you can react differently with what you described quite nicely there, Robert. The gravity and the counter force and all the rest of it. How do you respond to that?
Right.
And most of our response is, thank goodness, it's unconscious or subconscious. We don't want to be thinking about how we're balancing ourselves. Ask any Parkinson's patient how fun that is.
Right.
To have to think about that all the time. We don't want to think about that. We want to live our lives, right?
Right.
So we're very happy that things are subconscious. In fact, we want them to be there. So just imagine that invisible pebble is affecting the way that you're adjusting yourself
Right.
every moment that you're standing and walking. And I imagine that Alexander was standing most of the time when he recited. Maybe he sat down on a chair for the odd little piece, but I think most of the time he must have been standing up and, giving it his best to be or not to be, right?
Right.
And so he had that invisible. He sounds like he had not just one pebble. He sounded like he had a whole bunch of rocks in his shoes.
Right. Well, it doesn't just have to be a pebble in the foot. I mean, the pebble in the foot is kind of a metaphor, right? And the pebble could be somewhere else. The pebble could be in your pelvis or your knee or somewhere else. The point is something's causing you to distort things, and you're not really aware of that specific cause anymore.
You're not aware of the cause, but your feet are
paying the price.
The connection, the canary in the mine shaft. Your feet, what's going on in your feet are telling you a little bit whatever that is you're adjusted to. It could be an injury, it could be an emotional wound, it could be, any number of things, but it all shows up in your feet.
Well, because that's where the pedal meets the metal. I mean, that's it, right?
That's exactly right.
Yes.
So I haven't got the answer here, Robert. I mean, as I was talking to you before, I've been teaching Alexander for about 34 years, and I was thinking, well, by now I should know something about it. And I feel like, maybe this is the problem with being, questioning what you do on an ongoing basis, but I feel like, now I've just have to completely reorganize my thinking,
which is the essence of the Alexander technique, right?
I know. Damn it! After 34 years, I figured I could just sort of spew out the truth, in any number of different guises, and now I don't know what the heck to say to people anymore. I'm thinking that stand up straight and don't keep the smile is probably a good place to start. But
Yeah. Well, why don't we? I think we've kind of raised this question, and we're neither one of us is it has the answer, but I think maybe we should end the podcast here, and hopefully when it's posted on Facebook and so on, there will be some discussion around what we've been talking about, and maybe that could even lead to a second another podcast taking into account what other people have said. What do you think, Malcolm? Think that's a good idea? Oh, I think seem to have lost Malcolm. So I will end the podcast here. My guest has been Malcolm Bach, an Alexander teacher in Montreal, and we've been talking today about feet. And hopefully, I'll put information by the podcast on Malcolm's website and more places where you can find more information about the Alexander technique. So even though Malcolm's not here, thank you, Malcolm, and we'll talk again soon.